The UFC Octagon heads down under to Sydney, Australia this weekend for UFC 312 with 2 title fights at the top of the card, and they're both absolute bangers. Let's look forward to both of them and pick out some of the other fights you need to follow this weekend right here on the RDX Sports Podcast. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the RDX Sports Podcast. I'm Simon Head, and as we just said, the UFC heads to Australia this weekend. Sydney will play host to UFC 312 with the middleweight championship of the world on the line. Dricus Du Plessis putting his title on the line for the second time as he looks to take on Sean Strickland, the man he defeated to win the belt back at UFC 297. Is back for another run at the belt. Will it be Du Plessis? Will it be Sean Strickland? It's going to be a hell of a matchup. That first bout, when all 5 rounds, it was super close, went to a split decision. I thought at the time Du Plessis had done just enough to win it. Watching it back, I think he probably still did just about enough to win it. But it's a real coin flip fight. If someone wants to come up to me and say, "Sire, that was Sean Strickland's win. I think he did enough to win that," I think that's an acceptable outcome. It was such a close fight in that first meeting up there in Toronto, Canada, UFC 297. We had to have a rematch, but there was Israel Adesanya in the title picture as well. Du Plessis went on to face Adesanya. That was a matchup that had been brewing, had been building in the background for quite some time. They had to run that fight first, and Du Plessis submits Israel Adesanya in the 4th round at UFC 305. Probably the best performance we've seen from Still Knox in the UFC. Just showed that he can hang with an elite striker like that. Was able to mix his game up well, used his wrestling superbly, and then when he got the fight to the mat late on, he got that submission victory. There's been lots of detractors of Dricus Du Plessis over the course of his UFC career, saying his striking technique is sloppy, his defenses are wide open, his footwork is cumbersome, his gas tank looks questionable. Well, all of these things have still managed to translate into a world champion athlete. He is incredibly tough. He is incredibly fit. That gas tank thing, I think, is a complete red herring. He has got gas. He's got gas for days, that guy. He can go 25 minutes. Yeah, he looks absolutely knackered at the end of rounds, but his ability to recover and come back for the next 5 minutes and push the pace the way he does is unlike almost anybody else in that middleweight division. So gas tank is not a problem for Dricus Du Plessis. His striking technique, I think you can pick holes in that. He certainly is open to straight shots down the middle. He does walk forward winging hooks and can be caught. The thing with him is he's incredibly durable. He's only been knocked out once in his career, and that's by one of the hardest pound-for-pound punchers in mixed martial arts. Roberto Soldic is an absolute savage. And when they faced off at KSW, that was Soldic at his absolute best. They were fighting a welterweight back then. Du Plessis, as we know, is a huge man. How he got down to 170 back then is an absolute mystery, but he did. And I don't think that would have helped his punch resistance. I don't think that would have helped his durability at the time. And he got stopped in that fight. He actually beat Soldic in their first matchup. Soldic getting the revenge on him in London in the rematch. I was actually cage side for that fight. And but we could see from Du Plessis, he had something about him that, you know, he was possibly capable of making that leap up to the world stage with the UFC. And then when he moved up to middleweight and really added some muscle to that frame, you could see him really come into his own as a top draw 185-pound fighter, working his way up that UFC middleweight division. Let's take a look at some of the victories that he's picked up over the course of his UFC career. Steps into the Octagon, beats Marcus Perez, Brazilian veteran, by knockout on his UFC debut back in October 2020. Knocks out Trevin Giles, goes the distance with Brad Tavares, defeats him. Then he faces Darren Till in a fight that I think some people thought would be a real test for Dricus Du Plessis. He submits Darren Till in the 3rd round, midway through, face crank, but he stood and traded with Till. That really gave us a glimpse of just how far Dricus Du Plessis might be able to go in that middleweight division. He then moves on, stops Derek Brunson, takes on Robert Whittaker, former world champion Robert Whittaker. And this was the moment where Du Plessis went from being an interesting fringe contender to a legitimate threat at 185 pounds. This was basically a championship eliminator. Whoever won that fight would move on and challenge for the title against Sean Strickland, as it would turn out. He stops Robert Whittaker in round 2. And to do something like that to someone like him is an enormous statement in that 185-pound division. Robert Whittaker, one of the most respected fighters on the UFC roster, one of the most well-rounded, one of the most durable, one of the most skillful. Game plans his fights well, outstanding cardio, great stand-up, excellent defensive wrestling. Had pretty much everything in the bag. If you stack them up at that point side by side and went, who's going to win this fight? The majority of people would say Bobby Knuckles is going to defeat Stillnox here. Robert Whittaker will defeat Dricus Du Plessis. That is not what happened on a fight night at UFC 290. He got handled. Robert Whittaker got absolutely handled by Dricus Du Plessis. And at that point, we knew that Du Plessis was a legit championship threat. He gets in there in the title fight with Sean Strickland, and they have a 5-round war in Toronto at UFC 297. An absolute slugfest, back and forth, 5 super competitive rounds. We had obviously the infamous cut just on the top of the forehead there on Sean Strickland, which caused him some problems late on in that fight, blood running down into his eye. And I know he said quite recently, he said that blood running into his left eye, that was his lead eye, if you like, took all his depth perception away, made it very difficult for him to react to shots, being a counter fighter that he is. And he struggled, but he fought through, got to the end, thought he'd done enough to win a decision. 2 judges thought Dricus Du Plessis had done enough to win the decision, and it was he who got the win. The scorecards at the time could not have been any closer. 48-47 for Strickland, and then 2 48-47 cards for Dricus Du Plessis. Since then, Du Plessis gone on, took on Aleksandre at UFC 305, submitted him with a face crank in the 4th round, and I think that fight really surprised a lot of people. I think people thought that, okay, he's got past Strickland, but Israel is elite level. This is top of the milk stuff. You know, he is the creme de la creme of middleweight fighters, a guy with impeccable stand-up skills, a guy who could absolutely piece up anybody in his weight class and possibly most of the weight class above. His striking is that good. Despite this, he couldn't piece up Dricus Du Plessis. Du Plessis walked him down, walked through his strikes, landed big shots of his own. And although the result sheet will show that he won the fight by submission, it was his heavy-handed strikes that created the opening. It was wobbling Israel Adesanya with his shots that actually created the opening for him to take the fight to the mat and win that fight via that face crank submission. Dricus Du Plessis is the real deal. He might not fit into the stereotype of what MMA perfection looks like in terms of his fighting style necessarily, but look at the man as an athlete. He has got the lot. He's built like a truck for 185 pounds. Michael Bisping did an interview with him yesterday and put a photo out on his socials. Michael Bisping is a big man, former middleweight champion himself, walks around over 200 pounds on a good day. And Dricus Du Plessis was noticeably bigger than Michael Bisping. And this is during fight week, as he's starting to taper off, as he's getting ready for his weight cut. This is a big individual, and he could undoubtedly make a dent in that light heavyweight division if he ever chooses to move up, which I'm sure he will at some point. But this weekend, all business is at 185 pounds, and he takes on Sean Strickland, and it's going to be another absolute war. I can't see it going any other way. Strickland has arrived in Australia, doing Sean Strickland things, saying outlandish stuff as is his wont, but he does have this quality to him. For all of this daft, crazy, terrible stuff that he sometimes comes out with, underneath that, somewhere, it feels like there's a guy who's just desperate to be loved. You just get that impression with him, and putting all that rhetoric and all the insults out there front and center almost feels like he's putting a barrier up. And behind it is someone who just wants to be appreciated, wants to be loved, and wants to be respected. And feels like this is his way of having a place in this sport. There are definitely other ways of going about it, but this is the way that he's going about it. But inside the cage, there is no denying that this man is an absolute force. He's won some, he's lost some, but he's as competitive in every fight. I remember years ago, being in Berlin, Germany, for a UFC Fight Night event. Mark Munoz, Gabriel, I think, were the headliners. And Strickland fought Luke Barnett, the big slow. I thought Luke Barnett won that fight. I thought Luke Barnett had been somewhat robbed by the judges on that fight. Back then, Strickland was one of these fighters who was doing just enough to win fights. Another fighter who used to be a little bit like this was Jorge Masvidal. Both of them were of similar ilk in that their technical skills were just off the charts, but they always used to do just enough. They'd be 1% better than their opponent, and that would get them the win. But when they lost, it would be by a close decision, and it would always be super close in that regard. And that's what happened in Germany. He did it with Luke Barnett. He did it again at UFC 199, again, an event that I was fortunate enough to be at, against Tom Breeze in Inglewood, California. That was the night that Michael Bisping won the title against Luke Rockhold. As you can see, that's from the actual dais of the press conference, the post-fight press conference. The UFC staffers gave me that on my way out the door. So there you go, UFC 199. And again, Tom Breeze pushed him to the limit. Again, a very close fight that could have gone either way. And again, it was Strickland who got the split decision. And that was kind of how his career went. He had a finish here and there. He knocked out Alex Garcia. I'm just looking through his record now. He got knocked out by Eliseo Zaleski dos Santos. But in the main, he was always in competitive fights, but always felt like there was an extra gear that he didn't quite engage in fights. That all started to change. He lost a couple. He lost to Zaleski. Then he started to pick up the pace a little bit. Gets the win over Krzysztof Jotko. Gets the win over Uriah Hall. Gets the win over Jack Hermansson. And then he's building momentum at this point. He goes in there with Alex Pereira, International Fight Week. I will remember this vividly. We spoke to Chris Curtis, his teammate at Extreme Couture. Spoke to Chris Curtis during Fight Week. Curtis was going to be in his corner with Eric Nixick. And the prevailing wisdom, and wisdom isn't even a necessary word here, it was obvious what he needed to do against Alex Pereira. He needed to wrestle. He's got it in his locker. He doesn't use it very often, but he needed to wrestle. And we talked to Chris Curtis during Fight Week, and it was, is he actually going to do this? Because he keeps talking about standing with him. And Curtis was like, I have no idea. Like we're telling him what he needs to do. What he actually does on fight night is a complete roll of the dice. We have no idea. He's a man unto himself. And he went out there, decided he was going to stand and bang with Alex Pereira. Did not go well for him. Knocked out in half a round. And that really felt like the momentum had gone at that point. He's like, okay, maybe that's as far as he's going to go. He then faced Jared Cannonier, lost a split decision there. And he's like, okay, maybe he has hit his ceiling here. But then he bounced back. He beats Nassourdine Imavov, and that win has aged very nicely if you look at what Nassourdine did last week against Israel Adesanya. He then gets a strange main event with Abus Magomedov, and absolutely demolishes him in 2 rounds, just completely takes him to school, finishes him with absolute ease, and looks every inch a championship contender doing that. That then earned him a title fight with Israel Adesanya at UFC 293. Few people gave him a chance. I'll hold my hands up. I did not think that he would I thought he'd barely lay a glove on Izzy. I thought Izzy would sort of run rings around him, to be honest. And boy, was I proven wrong. Strickland put on an incredible performance. Sort of striking nous, controlled pressure, being within himself while still being able to extend his opponent, really taking Adesanya out of his game and forcing him onto the back foot for 25 full minutes. Gets the unanimous decision victory, a fully deserved one, no controversy, no split decisions there. Deservedly wins the title at UFC 293. Then he gets his fight with Dricus Du Plessis. And that fight that went 5 rounds, back and forth, nip and tuck. Who took this round? Who took that round? And when they got to the end, it was DDP whose hand was raised in victory. And we get the fight again this weekend. Strickland has since gone on and claimed a split decision win of his own against Paulo Costa, UFC 302, back in June last year. But now we're back. Du Plessis and Strickland. And how do we think this one's going to go in the rematch? I'll be honest, probably pretty much the same way the first fight went. I think it's going to be super close. It'll be interesting to see how the dynamic changes, particularly in the early rounds, because it was such a close fight first time round. The onus is probably going to be on both of them, particularly Strickland, to hit the ground running earlier and to make sure they don't concede early ground. And that first round is going to be particularly well contested, I think, because it's going to be the building block from which the rest of the fight can be put together. That first round is going to be absolutely crucial. Very often, fighters are sort of feeling each other out a little bit, trying to work out the range, the timing, the cadence of their opponent. And fighters can lose rounds doing that. You look at the Paul Hughes, Usman Nurmagomedov fight from the other day. Paul Hughes lost that first round. Had he won that first round, we'd have potentially had a different result. But he was downloading information. He was assessing Usman's striking style and making a statement that he wasn't going to move out of striking range and he was going to put the pressure on him. What he didn't do was land enough while he was doing it, and ultimately it cost him that round. And as the fight went on, unfortunately, that round would have been very helpful for him in the final reckoning. This first round here is going to be absolutely vital. Who will push the pace first? Who will push the pace hardest? And then the big question is, if it goes 25 minutes, have they both got the gas tank at that higher pace earlier in the fight to keep it going all the way through the 25 minutes? You know, there's peaks and valleys all the way through a 5-round fight. Who can maintain that pace through the full 25 minutes? I think Du Plessis can. I think Strickland probably can as well. But it's going to be really interesting to see how all of this pans out. So what about the keys to victory in the main event? I think for Strickland, it is 3 words: forward pressure and damage. The one thing he wasn't able to do in the first fight was to inflict visible damage of any significance on Dricus Du Plessis. And while the cut, some said it was from a headbutt, some said it's from a punch, that cut that was on the top of Sean Strickland's head was absolutely a factor, I think, in how some of these rounds were scored late on. So it was one of those where damage does matter. Damage does matter. Effective striking, effective grappling. And if you can effectively wound and injure your opponent during a fight, that's pretty effective striking. So we will see how this goes. I wouldn't be too surprised if we see Strickland mix more elbows in from close range, just to try and slice up Du Plessis at close range. Maybe try and get an eye to start swelling up or to open up a cut here and there. Du Plessis is he's pretty solid. He doesn't seem to bust up too easily. So it's going to take some doing. Also, he's got to get close enough to him for that to happen. If you're Du Plessis, I think the key to victory for him is to attack the body. I really do. You look at how Strickland fights. He's got that Philly shell, hands high, elbows tucked. But I do think there's opportunity there for Du Plessis, whether it be with body kicks, but particularly with hooks to the body when they're in close range, to land some really damaging stuff to the body, bring those hands down and sat that gas tank just a little bit for the later rounds. And I think if he invests in the body early, I think that can be a really, really strong route to victory for the champion on Saturday night. But it really is a coin flip of a fight. I know the bookies have sided quite heavily with Dricus Du Plessis. He's a sizable favourite at this point. I'm just going to pull up the UFC fight card on UFC.com because they have the odds alongside the matchups. I think they're probably DraftKings odds. Let's have a look. Dricus Du Plessis is a -205 favourite to Sean Strickland's +170. So there's a bit of distance between them there. 2-1 favourite, basically, Dricus Du Plessis. So I think that's enough for you to think that if it's a coin flip fight, that Strickland offers you some value. And if you're going to back Strickland to win, I think you're probably going to back him to win on the scorecards. I'm siding with Du Plessis, though. I just think that if you look at their respective performances and you try and gauge how much extra they potentially have to give, I think Dricus might have a little bit more that he can bring into his game. The X factor for Sean Strickland is his team. Eric Niksicki is one of, if not the best head coach in mixed martial arts today. He might even have Alex Pereira in the corner. I don't know what technical benefit that's going to be for him, but from a mental standpoint, who knows? Maybe that'll be a factor. According to Strickland this week, talking to the UFC website, that Pereira does not like Dricus Du Plessis at all. So very interested to see how all that plays out as well. But I think when push comes to shove, I think Dricus has a little bit more in the tank. I think he's got a little bit more to offer. And Dan Hardy made a great observation, actually, in his Outlawed Picks podcast. I recommend you check that out as well on his own YouTube channel. He was describing the two fighters as if they were playlists, if they had their own playlist with their own techniques in, and said that Strickland's maybe got 4 or 5 tracks that he plays on loop, and they are his techniques, his go-to techniques that he uses during a fight. He said Du Plessis got a lot more than that. He's got more tracks on the playlist, so to speak. So very interested to see how this one goes. I think Dricus can mix things up a little bit more than maybe Sean can. He can lean on the wrestling a little bit more. He's more than happy to stand and bang. That we do know. But we shall see. We shall see. It's going to be an absolute cracker of a matchup, the main event at UFC 312. Push comes to shove, I'm going to side with Dricus Du Plessis, but let's just sit back, relax, and enjoy an absolute war in that main event at UFC 312. All right, let's take a look at the co-main event at UFC 312, a strawweight title fight between Zhang Weili and Tatiana Suarez. And if the MMA world had had a little bit more justice to it, we would have seen this fight probably once or twice already. But injuries and just sheer bad luck have meant that Tatiana Suarez, despite being in the UFC for a fair few years now, he's still only 10-0 as a professional fighter. She's missed so much time through illness and injury, and she's finally getting her first crack at a UFC championship belt. The big question for her, I suppose, is, has the weight meant that this is kind of like a millstone around her neck? I remember talking to Michael Bisping about this. The fact that he had to wait for so long, did it become a little bit of a weight of burden on him? And the fact that he got his title shot on such short notice was an actual blessing for him, because he didn't have time to sort of mull it all over and start to realize the magnitude of the opportunity in front of him. He just had to get ready and get in and fight, and it worked out for him. For Tatiana Suarez, she's had a lead up to this. She's had a full camp for this. She's ready for this. She's been ready for this for a few years, in fairness. And she's taken on Zhang Weili, who it's really a toss-up between her and Joanna Jędrzejczyk for the greatest strawweight champion in UFC history. I think if Zhang wins on Saturday, she will equal Joanna's record for 6 title fight wins at strawweight in the UFC. For me, I preferred watching Joanna fight. I just think her fights are just incredible. She's one of my favourite fights to watch of all time. I've been fortunate enough to be at a fair few of them, and her fights were just always just all action wars. Zhang Weili, a more complete mixed martial artist than Joanna, I would say. She's got more to her game, more well-rounded, and she's been outstanding in her UFC run so far. She lost the title. She's now bounced back. She's got the belt again. But interestingly, and it depends which bookmaker you look at, they can't make their minds up, these bookies. There's no consensus. They keep flip-flopping. At the moment, as I look at the odds right now, Tatiana Suarez is a narrow favourite with DraftKings to defeat Zhang Weili. Yesterday, it was the other way around. Zhang Weili was the favourite. So as money comes in on these two fighters, the odds are kind of flip-flopping in terms of who's going to be the favourite. Basically, it's a coin flip. It is that close of a matchup. But it's going to be a fascinating one because you've got Zhang Weili, who is seasoned at this level. She's had a stack of fights at the top of UFC fight cards. She's used to fighting in championship bouts. She's used to contesting titles. Tatiana Suarez, credentials-wise, has everything you could possibly want to be a UFC champion, except she hasn't fought for a UFC title yet. This is her first go. How will she react? Is she ready? She certainly looks focused and ready. She's got a world champion boyfriend in Patchy Mix alongside her, a Bellator champion at bantamweight. So that champion mindset is in the house day to day, and it's not just with her, it's with her other half as well. I think that's important. I think that's going to be helpful. But the big question here is whether Tatiana Suarez can employ her wrestling game on Zhang Weili. I think Zhang is probably more well-rounded. I think Zhang will probably have the edge in the stand-up. I think Zhang will probably have the edge in speed. But Tatiana Suarez will be stronger, I believe. I think she'll have by far the better wrestling. And if the fight goes to the mat, I think Suarez is the superior grappler. So it really is. It's going to be strength and wrestling and grappling versus speed and striking. It's oversimplifying it to say it quite like that. But that's kind of the line of sort of differentiation between these two fighters if you look at how their skills actually mesh on fight night. It's a fascinating clash, just because we don't know. There's a great unknown with Tatiana in that we've seen her steamroll opponents, but this is a 5-round fight for a title against arguably the best strawweight fighter to ever pull on a set of gloves. So this is a real big one, and I'm really excited to see how this one pans out. I'm leaning towards and new. I'll be honest. I think Tatiana is ready and has been ready for a while to fight for the title. The only thing preventing her from doing so is activity. And, that's been down to these injuries that she's had to battle. But now she's fully fit, and assuming that she is 100% going into this, and we have to assume that she is, I think she'll be too big, too strong, and too good for Zhang Weili. As good and as brilliant as Zhang Weili is, and she is brilliant, I just think that Tatiana Suarez might just be that cut above. We shall see. It's going to be a fantastic matchup. That will be the co-main event of UFC 312 in Sydney. Will it be Anne Steele? Will it be Anne Yu? Hit me up on the socials. Let me know who you're picking in these two big fights. Will it be Du Plessis or Strickland in the main event? Will it be Zhang Weili or Tatiana Suarez in the co-main event at Simon Head Sport on the socials? Let me know. And we'll see how those two title fights pan out on Saturday night. All right, that's the two title fights at UFC 312 checked off here on the RDX Sports Podcast. But what about the undercard? There's been a bit of criticism of this fight card, saying it's one of the weaker pay-per-view cards we've seen in a while. And I think in terms of like ranked contenders, it probably is. But that does not mean that we are completely deprived of good matchups. I've got a few lined up here. We'll run through them and I'll just highlight a few for you. Fights that I think you should definitely be paying a little bit of extra attention to on fight night. Let's start with the featured preliminary card fight at featherweight. Australia's Jack Jenkins taking on Brazil's Gabriel Santos Trust me, this is going to be a banger, an absolute banger. I would be very surprised. It's going to take something big on the main card to stop this from being a fight in the night, I believe, because the way these two guys fight, it's just, you can just see from their respective fighting styles that this is going to be an absolute war. Santos came into the UFC and gave Lerone Murphy all he could handle and really pushed him to the limit. I think it was a split decision in the end that Lerone got. And of course, even though he lost to Lerone in that fight, his performance was one that really showed that he was right there with him for across that 3-round duration. So the performance has aged really well, given that Lerone has gone on and done the things that he's done. And I think Lerone's in the top 10 now in the UFC featherweight division. Jenkins and Santos, neither one of them ranked. Jenkins had a sit down with the UFC. I actually did the interview feature for Jack Jenkins this week. Check that out at UFC.com. And in that interview, he said he felt that both Santos and himself are top 10 or certainly ranked featherweight fighters without a number next to their name. And he cited Santos's performance against Murphy in a fight that Jenkins thought that Santos had won. So there's a lot of respect from Jenkins towards his opponent this weekend. Jenkins has only lost the once in the UFC, and that was due to a horrible, horrible elbow injury. I think it was a dislocation, actually. Completely tore all of the ligaments in his elbow, needed reconstructive surgery on his elbow, fully recovered from that, came back, finished Herbert Burns in fine style last time, and now he's looking to just pick up where he left off and keep moving towards the ranked positions at 145 pounds. Great fighter to watch. Really enjoy watching Jack Jenkins fights. Gabriel Santos, super exciting as well. These two are just going to mesh perfectly, and I think it's a tough one to pick. I think Santos is the betting favourite, but I certainly wouldn't rule out Jenkins. I think Jenkins has the sort of punch power to completely turn this fight on its head. So really looking forward to this potential fight of the night clash, this one. So make sure that if you're going to take a pee break or you're going to head off to the kitchen and make some snacks, don't do it during the feature prelim, because I think it might just deliver the best action of the entire fight card. Jack Jenkins, Gabriel Santos. Make sure you check that one out on Saturday. Another fight that I think you should keep a close eye on that televised prelim card, that sort of middle prelim card, is the women's flyweight fight between Wang Cong and Bruna, Brasil. There's been a lot of hype on Wang Cong. She burst into the UFC on a sea of finishes. You know, she's gone in there and she wanted to road to UFC, gets the submission finish there, goes into the UFC, has her debut against Victoria Leonardo, knocks her out in 62 seconds for a performance of the night bonus. And everyone's like, wow, okay, we might have something here. A Chinese contender at 125 pounds. That's going to be something well worth following. They then put her in with Gabriel Fernandez, who I think was a short notice opponent. I think it might have been a late replacement. And Gabriel Fernandez sprung an enormous shock. I think it was in Macau. Yan versus Figueiredo were the headliners on that card. And Gabriel Fernandez submits Wang Cong, chokes her out cold in the second round in Macau. So now the question is, just how good is Wang Cong? Have we just seen her hit her ceiling? Was she getting a little bit ahead of her skis, so to speak? Was she getting a little bit ahead of herself? She certainly looked super confident going into that fight with Fernandez. And Fernandez just went in there and got the job done. Life-changing win for her, by the way. That was one of the real feel-good moments of that event. But for Wang Cong, the Joker, it was certainly no laughing matter for her. The question now is, how will she do? She's taking on Bruna, Brasil. And I think this is a fascinating fight for a couple of reasons. Number one, Bruna Brasil's been given virtually no chance by the odds makers, which I disagree with, and I'll explain why in a second. But Bruna Brasil is a strawweight moving up to flyweight. And so she's moved up a weight class to take on Wang Cong. Normally, if you're moving up a weight and you're taking on someone who has knockout power, a good striking like Wang Cong, that is not necessarily a great mix. However, Bruna Brasil, I think, is way, way better than a plus 350 odds that I'm looking at right now would suggest. Wang Cong is a minus 455 favourite. So it's almost 5-1 favourite in a 2-horse race, which is nuts. And Bruna Brasil is coming off the biggest win of her career, which I saw live at UFC 304 in Manchester. She beat Molly McCann, and she fought really, really well. Really good all-round MMA game. She stood with Molly when she needed to. She took Molly to the ground when she needed to. She controlled things on the mat when she needed to. She just really intelligent use of her mixed martial arts skills. She's got an excellent team, an excellent corner. Middleweight contender Caio Borralho will be in her corner as part of the Fighting Nerds team. That Fighting Nerds team, I know the name immediately grabs your attention, but they are doing incredible stuff in the UFC. That team are doing so well individually and as a team. And Bruna Brasil is certainly doing her part in the women's strawweight or now flyweight division. So we'll see how this one goes. I think it's fascinating for 2 reasons. One, Wang is going to come out looking to make a real statement because it did not go her way last time. She was a bit potentially overconfident last time, and she got her comeuppance a little bit. She got a little bit of a, as the kids would say online, she got fraud checked a little bit. But I don't think she's a fraud in any way. I think she's a potential star in the making. But you have to sometimes go through these little learning fights. And that last one against Gabriel Fernandez, I think, was a learning fight for sure, given the way that panned out. And against Bruna Brasil, she's going to be facing a very well-rounded, a very well-coached, and a very disciplined fighter who knows her skills, knows what she's doing, and is in a decent run of form herself. The odds say it's a complete mismatch. I beg to differ. I think Bruna Brasil has a very, very strong chance of winning this fight. And I think if you want to look for a little bit of betting value on this card, a Bruna Brasil win is decent value, I think, especially on the scorecards. I think that's probably one of the good value picks of the night, potentially, if you're looking for an upset. Wang could go in there and completely blow the doors off her, though. So we'll see how this one goes. If Wang has more difficulties, then I think Brasil has the skill set to take this into deep water and to win the fight on the scorecards. If Wang can establish a striking early, this could get very violent very quickly. Whichever way it goes, I think it's going to be a lot of fun to watch. 2 fighters I'm quite high on in terms of their relative skill sets. If Bruna wins, she becomes a legitimate factor in 2 weight classes. If she loses, it doesn't matter too much. She can go down to strawweight and continue there. But sometimes these fighters who don't have a lot to lose, they're the most dangerous ones. And Wang Cong knows that she's got to pick up a win here. She can't afford to lose. So we'll see how this one goes. Wang Cong, Bruna Brasil, on that prelim card. Make sure you follow that one. All right, the final matchup we'll just profile for you here on the RDX Sports Podcast at UFC 312 is the first bout on the televised prelims. So you've got the UFC Fight Pass prelims first, then they go live on ESPN Plus in the States, live on TNT Sports right here in the UK. And the first fight will be between Australia's Colby Thicknesse and Georgia's Aleksandre Topuria. Yes, you heard me right. Aleksandre Topuria, the brother of featherweight champion Ilia Topuria, is making his UFC debut this weekend. And there's a lot of hype around him. He's currently 5-1. Just looking at his record, hasn't fought at the highest of levels yet. But what you can see from his record is that he loves a finish. Each of his last 3 fights have been won inside the distance. Each of those 3 fights have been won by TKO or knockout, and each of those 3 wins have come in the very first round. This is a guy who fights like he's got an early dinner reservation. Will he do the same again against Colby Thicknesse, who is the local guy, Australian, undefeated at 7-0, and a guy who has fought at a decent level on the local scene in Australia. He is the Hex Fight Series champion at 135 pounds. He won that belt in his last fight back in November last year. Now he's got his call up to the UFC. Relatively short notice call up to take on Topuria. But here he is, another one off the production line in Australia. Comes out of the same gym as Aleksandre Volkanovski. Trains under coach Joe Lopez. I know he's also worked with the City Kickboxing guys as well. He's a dangerous man. He's a dangerous finisher. 2 KOs, 2 submissions on his record. Never lost. How will he do against Aleksandre Topuria? The Topuria name could be a lot of pressure, but there's a suggestion that this guy might turn out to be almost as good as his brother. So we'll see how this one goes. It's very early on in both fighters' careers on the world stage. They're both making their Octagon debuts head-to-head this weekend. Should be a fun one to kick off that preliminary card in Australia. Colby Thicknesse versus Aleksandre Topuria. That should be a fun one. And I think, given where they train, who they're affiliated with, you're gonna have Ilia Topuria in one corner, Aleksandre Volkanovski in the other corner, and who knows, we might just see those two facing off again in the Octagon a little bit later on in 2025. We shall see. But for now, it's Topuria and Thicknesse going at it at UFC 312. It should be a good one. Looking forward to seeing how both of those guys fare on their respective debuts. All right, that's just about all we've got time for on this edition of the RDX Sports Podcast. Really looking forward to Fight Night this weekend at UFC 312. Not as many stars on this card as you would normally expect for a pay-per-view, but as I've just run down for you, some interesting bouts further down that fight card. Do keep an eye on that Jenkins Gabriel Santos fight. I think that is an absolute sleeper for fight of the night. And then, of course, the main card culminating in those 2 title fights. Zhang Weili versus Tatiana Suarez for the strawweight title. And then the main event, Dricus Du Plessis, Sean Strickland, the rematch for all the marbles at 185 pounds. It should be a good one. Enjoy the fights this weekend. Give us a follow on the socials, at Simon Head on all social platforms. Follow RDX Sports across all social platforms as well. Give us a like, give us a subscribe, be a part of what we're doing here at the RDX Sports Podcast moving forward. Hit me up on the socials. Let me know what you'd like to see, what you'd like to hear on the pod in 2025. We might see if we can get this thing on the road at some point during the year as well. Maybe a little bit more to come on that at some point further down the line. But for now, let's settle in and enjoy the action from Sydney, Australia. Enjoy the fights this weekend, ladies and gentlemen, and I'll speak to you next week.